My daughter wants her biological father to walk her down the aisle instead of my husband, who has always been there for her. But if he's not part of the wedding, neither is his money. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I'm married to the most wonderful man, James. He's not only a fantastic husband, but also an incredible stepfather to my daughter Emily. James came into our lives when Emily was only 5 years old. Her biological father, Tom, left us when she was just a baby and has only appeared sporadically since then, never really stepping up as a father. When James came into the picture, it was like a breath of fresh air. From the beginning, he treated Emily as if she were his own child. I remember when we first started dating. He would bring small gifts for her, nothing extravagant, just sweet things like a book or a cute stuffed animal. It was clear that he was trying to bond with her, and it worked beautifully. Emily grew attached to him pretty quickly. One thing that really stands out is how much James supported Emily's love for ballet. She started taking ballet lessons when she was 6 years old, and James never missed a single performance. He was always there, cheering her on, sometimes even with tears in his eyes. He made sure she had everything she needed: ballet shoes, pretty tutus, and even extra lessons with a private tutor when a big performance was coming up. When Emily was around 9 years old, she had a major performance coming up, and she was really nervous the day before. James took her to the park, and they spent hours talking and practicing her routine. They even came up with a silly chant to help calm her nerves. That night, he stayed up with her, going over her steps until she felt confident. The next day, she performed flawlessly, and I know it was because James had been right there with her. But it wasn't just the big moments that mattered. James was always there for the everyday things too. When Emily struggled with math in high school, James would sit with her every night after work, helping her with her homework. Sometimes they'd be at the kitchen table for hours, and even though James was exhausted from work, he never let it show. He was always patient and never gave up on her. As amazing as James has been, there's always been a lingering sadness when it comes to Emily and her biological father, Tom. There were times when she'd ask about him, wondering why he wasn't around, and it broke my heart to see her like that. I remember one Father's Day when Emily made 2 cards, one for James and one for Tom. She asked if she could send the card to Tom, and of course, I said yes. But she never got a response. The disappointment in her eyes felt like a punch to the gut. James was always very understanding about it. He never tried to replace Tom, but made it clear that he was there for Emily no matter what. On Emily's 13th birthday, she received a letter from Tom apologizing for his absence. She was so happy at first, but as weeks turned into months without hearing from him again, the pain in her eyes was hard to bear. During those times, James became even more present, always reassuring her that she was loved and important. One Christmas, Emily became deeply depressed. She had hoped Tom would reach out during the holidays, but when he didn't, she sank into a dark place. James noticed and did everything he could to cheer her up. He planned an elaborate Christmas treasure hunt around the house with little notes and hidden gifts. By the end of it, Emily was laughing and smiling again. That's James always thinking of others, always putting Emily first. When Emily graduated from high school, James was the one who cried the most. He gave a touching speech at her graduation party about how proud he was of her and how much he admired her strength. It was so emotional that even Emily, who usually keeps her emotions in check, couldn't hold back her tears. James made sure she had everything she needed for college, even setting up a fund so she wouldn't have to worry about student loans. About a year ago, Emily announced her engagement to her long-term boyfriend, Mark, and it was a moment I'll never forget. We were all gathered for a family dinner at our house, a rare evening when we all had the night off. Emily and Mark had been together for years, and we all loved him, so this felt like the natural next step. Emily waited until dessert to make her announcement. She stood up, looking both nervous and excited, and said, "Everyone, I have some news." Then she lifted her hand, revealing a beautiful ring that had been hidden in her pocket so we wouldn't notice. "Mark and I are getting married," she said. James jumped out of his chair. He was so thrilled for her. He hugged Emily so tightly that I thought she might burst. The pride and happiness radiating from him were undeniable. He had always been so good to her, and seeing her so happy just made his day. He shook Mark's hand and hugged him too. James was the first to offer to pay for the wedding. "We want to give you the best day possible," he said, looking at Emily and Mark. "Nothing but the best for our girl." Emily was over the moon and incredibly grateful, hugging him again and thanking him over and over. From that moment on, James was fully involved in the wedding planning. He was excited about every little detail, wanting everything to be perfect for Emily's big day. We visited countless venues, tasted a ridiculous amount of cakes, and attended endless meetings with florists and decorators. James was there every step of the way, offering suggestions, but always making sure Emily's vision came first. A few months ago, Emily started reconnecting with her biological father, Tom. It came out of nowhere. Tom suddenly wanted to be a part of her life now that she was getting married. I was pretty skeptical, given his track record, but Emily was excited. She had always wanted to have a relationship with him, so I understood why she was giving him a chance. At first, it seemed to be going well. Emily was happy, and it was nice to see her smile about something that had once caused her so much pain. But then, her attitude toward James began to shift. It was subtle at first, forgetting to invite him to important meetings or brushing off his suggestions, things she used to value so much. James noticed it too, but didn't say anything. He's always been the patient and understanding type. One night, we were all having dinner together, and Emily was talking about some new ideas Tom had for the wedding. James offered a suggestion, and Emily cut him off mid-sentence, saying, "Tom and I already decided on that." The look on James' face was heartbreaking. He just nodded and stayed quiet for the rest of the meal. There were other signs too. Emily used to ask James for help with things like fixing her car or going over her finances, but now she'd mentioned that Tom was taking care of those things. I could see James looking a bit lost, as if he wasn't sure where he fit in anymore. He never complained, but I could tell it was affecting him. I decided to talk to Emily about it one morning over coffee. "Emily, honey, I've noticed you've been a little distant with James lately. Is everything okay?" She looked at me, a bit surprised and annoyed. "Mom, you're overreacting. I'm just busy with the wedding and reconnecting with Tom. It's a lot to handle." I didn't want to push too hard, but I also couldn't let it go. "I understand, but James loves you so much. He's done everything to make sure your wedding is perfect. I just feel like he's being left out." Emily said she appreciated everything James had done, but insisted that Tom, her real father, should walk her down the aisle. She wanted to give him the chance to be a part of it. Her words hurt me. I knew she wanted to connect with Tom, but I also knew how much James had given to her and how much he loved her as if she were his own daughter. I told her I understood, but I didn't want James to feel pushed aside. Emily brushed it off, saying she wasn't excluding him, just trying to balance things now that Tom was back. Things didn't get better after that conversation. If anything, they got worse. Emily started calling Tom Dad in front of James, something she had never done before. The first time was when we were discussing the seating arrangements for the reception. She looked at Tom and said, "Dad, what do you think of this?" I saw James flinch a little, though he tried to hide it. He excused himself shortly after, saying he had work to finish. I tried to talk to James about it, but he brushed it off, saying he was happy that Emily was reconnecting with her father. But I could see the pain in his eyes. He had spent years being the father Tom never was, and now he felt like he was being pushed aside. Emily started spending more and more time with Tom, going out to lunch, having long phone calls, and updating him on every little wedding detail. James was still there, helping and supporting, but it felt like he was becoming a background character in a story where he used to be the hero. About a week ago, during a family dinner, Emily dropped a bombshell that took us all by surprise. We were sitting around the table, enjoying a nice meal, when Emily cleared her throat and said she had something important to discuss. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, but I tried to listen. She started by looking at Mark and then at Tom, who had joined us for dinner. "I've been thinking a lot about the wedding and the roles everyone will play," she said. "I've decided that I want Tom to have a significant role in the ceremony." We all knew this was coming, but hearing it out loud was a different matter. Emily kept talking, completely unaware of the tension that had just filled the room. "I want my real father to walk me down the aisle. I think it's only right that Tom, my biological father, has this special role." James looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He took a deep breath and nodded, his voice steady but soft. "If that's what you want, Emily, I'll support your decision." It was heartbreaking. Months ago, Emily had asked James to walk her down the aisle, and she had been so excited about it, practically jumping for joy. I remember her saying she couldn't imagine anyone else walking her down the aisle because James had always been there for her. He was over the moon. But now, things were different. Emily was caught up in the idea of having her real father play this major role and couldn't see how much she was hurting the man who had been her father in every way that mattered. I couldn't just sit there, so I said, "Emily, do you realize what you're doing? James has been there for you through everything. He's the one who raised you, supported you." She responded, "Mom, I get that, but this is important to me. I want Tom to be a part of my wedding. He's my biological father." I looked at James, who was doing his best to keep his emotions in check. "Emily," I said quietly, "I understand you want to include Tom, but this is a big change. Just think about how much this means, not just to you, but to everyone involved." She was clearly frustrated. "I've already made up my mind. Tom is my dad, and he should walk me down the aisle." End of discussion. After that, dinner continued in uncomfortable silence. After a lot of reflection and heartache, I finally decided to talk to Emily about the situation. I felt like I had to draw a line somewhere. I told Emily that if James wasn't going to be considered a father in this wedding, if his role was going to be replaced by Tom's, then we should reconsider his financial support as well. I made it clear that the money James had put into this wedding wasn't just a financial contribution, it was a gesture of love and paternal support. If he wasn't going to walk her down the aisle, then it seemed only fair to rethink his involvement. I know that might sound harsh, but I felt torn. James had been more than a stepfather to Emily, and now he was being sidelined. It felt like a betrayal to see him ignored in favor of Tom, who had been mostly absent from Emily's life. When I first brought it up, James tried to talk me out of it. He didn't want to make things worse or cause more conflict. He always puts Emily's happiness first, even if it means enduring his own pain in silence. He told me we should focus on making her happy, no matter how much it hurt him. But I couldn't just sit by and watch anymore. Every day, I saw how this was affecting James. I wanted Emily to understand what she was really doing, not just the symbolic gestures, but the real, tangible ways James had been a father to her. Despite James' protests, I went ahead and had the conversation with Emily. I made it clear that this wasn't about the money, it was about acknowledging the role James had played in her life. When I said this, I never expected Emily to explode the way she did. Her reaction was intense, and honestly, it was quite painful. She became really upset, accusing James of using his money to control and manipulate her wedding plans. It was shocking to see how quickly she went from being a loving daughter to feeling cornered and betrayed. The next thing I knew, Emily started spreading rumors among our family and friends, portraying James as some sort of villain. She claimed that he was using his financial support to control how the wedding should be. This created a huge rift in the family. People started taking sides, and the division was clear. Some sympathized with Emily's desire to include Tom, while others felt James was being treated unfairly. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to defend James while also attempting to keep the peace. In the midst of all the chaos, I asked Emily why she didn't ask Tom to help pay for the wedding, especially since he was suddenly so important to her. I thought it was a fair question, especially given that Tom had become such a big part of the wedding plans. Emily told me she had asked, but he said he didn't have any money saved for something like that. After much thought, James made the tough decision to step back completely. He decided that he couldn't remain involved in the wedding, either emotionally or financially. It was his way of protecting himself from more pain and making a statement about how deeply he had been hurt. It wasn't an easy choice, but he felt it was the only way to preserve his dignity and sanity. The impact of James' decision was immediate and enormous. Without his financial support, the wedding preparations turned into chaos. Emily had been counting on James' contributions to cover a significant portion of the costs. Now, with that funding gone, she was forced to figure out how to make up the difference. In the end, Emily had to scale back the wedding significantly. The beautiful venue she had dreamed of was the first thing to go. She had to settle for a much simpler location. Some things had already been paid for, like her dress, so at least that remained intact. In the midst of the chaos, as the wedding day approached, it became clear that James and I wouldn't be attending. A few days after the wedding, Emily called us. That conversation was one of the hardest I've ever had. She told us that we had ruined her wedding by pulling our support. Now, some of our relatives are siding with Emily, saying we should have gone along with what she wanted to keep the peace. They believe James and I overreacted and that family should always come first, no matter the circumstances. It's hard to feel misunderstood and unsupported by people who should know the full story. I'm posting this on Reddit because I need an impartial opinion. Am I in the right here, or should we have paid for the wedding? Update 1. Thank you for taking the time to comment. After reading your opinions, I really believe we did the right thing. A few months have passed since the wedding, and I wish I could say things have improved, but unfortunately, they haven't. Emily still isn't speaking to James or me. It's as if she has completely erased us from her life, and honestly, it's heartbreaking. I've tried reaching out to her several times, hoping we could have a calm conversation and work things out, but she doesn't want to hear anything from us. To be frank, Emily is acting like a spoiled child. I know that sounds harsh, but I'm at my wit's end. She's behaving like a brat who didn't get her way, and instead of trying to understand our perspective, she's clinging to her stance and refusing to acknowledge how much she's hurt James. Every time I think about it, I feel a mix of sadness and frustration. I understand that reconnecting with her biological father was important to Emily, but I can't comprehend how she's so quickly disregarded everything James has done for her. It's like she's forgotten all the sacrifices he made, all the times he was there for her when Tom wasn't even in the picture. And now, because she didn't get what she wanted, she's throwing a tantrum and cutting us out of her life. What's even more frustrating is how she's playing the victim to anyone who will listen. I've heard from some family members that Emily has been spreading her version of the story, and it's clearly biased. Some of our relatives are even starting to believe her side, which only complicates things further. I feel like I'm constantly defending James and myself, trying to set the record straight, but Emily's influence seems stronger than the truth at this point. I didn't want to believe that Emily could be so selfish, but here we are. She's always been a bit stubborn, but this level of entitlement is something completely new. It's like she expects the world to revolve around her, and when it doesn't, she gets angry and refuses to take responsibility for her actions. Sorry for venting, but I've never been this frustrated before, and this has given me an outlet to release all my feelings. Update 2. It's been a few months since my last update, and things have taken a rather unexpected turn. I'm not sure how to feel about what's happening, so I thought I'd come here for some advice. Last weekend, Emily showed up at our house unexpectedly. Honestly, I didn't know what to expect since she's been so distant and cold since the wedding. When she appeared at the door, I was shocked, but I let her in because, well, she's still my daughter despite everything that's happened. After we sat down, Emily told me that she and Mark are in serious financial trouble. Apparently, she went way over budget for the wedding, maxed out her credit cards, and now has debt collectors calling her constantly. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. We all knew the wedding was expensive, even after they had to cut some things, but I had no idea she had stretched herself so thin. I asked her how on earth she could let this happen, especially knowing what her financial limits were. That's when she dropped the bombshell. It was our fault. She had been counting on our help for the wedding, and when we withdrew our support, we left her in a desperate situation. My jaw practically hit the floor. Our fault? After everything that had happened? After she pushed James aside and said those awful things about him? It took everything in me not to lose my temper right then and there. James wasn't home at the time, so it was just the two of us. I took a deep breath and asked her, "Why don't you ask your beloved dad Tom for help?" I know it was a bit sarcastic, but I couldn't help it. She looked down and told me she already had, and, surprise, surprise, Tom refused. I shouldn't have been surprised. A part of me saw this coming a mile away. She then started pleading, saying she had nowhere else to turn, and even offering that it would be a small loan that she would pay back. I could see the desperation in her eyes, and it broke my heart a little. Despite everything, she's still my child, and seeing her like this was hard. But at the same time, I couldn't just forget what had happened. I told her that a lot had happened, especially with her accusations, and that I needed time to think about it. She seemed disappointed but accepted it and left. Now I'm in this horrible position where I have to decide what to do next. Part of me is afraid to tell James. I know he'd jump at the chance to help Emily because not contributing to her wedding has been eating him up. Even though he withdrew, I know it's been hard for him, and I can see he's still hurting over the whole thing. But another part of me feels that helping Emily now would only be enabling her behavior. She needs to understand that actions have consequences. She can't just come running to us every time she's in trouble, especially after the way she treated us. What do you think? Should I tell James about Emily's request? Should we help her, or is it time for some tough love? Any advice or perspective would be really helpful right now. Thanks in advance. Update 3. I wanted to share with you what's happened recently, as I didn't see this coming at all. After my last update, I spent a lot of time thinking about Emily's request and how to handle the situation. I knew I had to talk to James about Emily's visit and her plea for money, but I also knew it was going to be a difficult conversation. James has been incredibly strong and patient throughout all of this, but the wounds Emily inflicted are still fresh, and I wasn't sure how he would react. Finally, one night after dinner, I gathered the courage to tell James about Emily's visit and her request for money. To be honest, I was worried about how he'd take it, especially because I know how much he loves Emily, despite everything that's happened. As I spoke, I watched his face, waiting to see that spark of concern and paternal love that he always has when it comes to her. However, what I saw this time was different. James remained silent, taking in everything I told him. Then, in a calm voice, he said something I didn't expect. "I can't do it." I was quiet for a moment, then reacted. "What do you mean you can't do it?" James, with a bit of sadness, told me there's only so much pain a father can endure. Even though I'm not her biological father, I've always seen her as my daughter. But now, after everything that's happened, I just can't give her the money. I can't keep being the emotional and financial backup while she continues to push me aside and treat me like a stranger in her life. This has been too painful, and I'm not sure how much more I can take. I felt a lump in my throat as I listened to James. I knew how much this was costing him emotionally, and seeing him reach this point of exhaustion confirmed how much he had been suffering because of this. He wasn't being cruel or vindictive, he was just protecting himself from more hurt. The next day, after thinking it over, I called Emily to give her the news. Before I told her, I asked how much money she needed to get out of debt. The amount she mentioned took my breath away, $35,000. That's not a small sum, and considering that a lot of her debt was due to luxury expenses, I told her, "I talked to James, and we're not going to be able to lend you the money. This isn't easy for us, but there are limits to what we can bear, especially after everything that's happened. It's not that we don't want to help you, but he's deeply hurt, and we can't ignore that." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Emily asked, with a tone of desperation, "What am I supposed to do now? Tom's not exactly in my life right now." I asked her what she meant by that, and after a moment of hesitation, Emily explained that since she had asked Tom for financial help, he had been avoiding her calls. He barely responded to her messages and had generally disappeared from her life once again. The fact that Tom wasn't living up to Emily's expectations didn't surprise me in the least. After all, he had been absent for most of her life, and now that things were difficult, it seemed like he had reverted to his old behavior patterns. Emily tried to justify it, saying maybe he was busy or didn't know how to handle the situation, but to me, it was clear that Tom wasn't the support she hoped he would be. It's ironic, really. Now, not only will she have a massive debt hanging over her head that will make her wedding memories negative, but she'll probably have plenty of photos from her wedding with her biological father, who abandoned her again. If that's not karma, I don't know what is. Update 4. I have an update about my life and Emily, so I'm back. After 3 months, I'm only writing this because of what happened a few days ago. It was a quiet afternoon at home. James and I were preparing dinner when we heard the sound of a car pulling up in the driveway. We weren't expecting anyone, so neither of us made any move to answer the door at first. Eventually, James went to check. When he opened the door, what I saw was completely unexpected. There stood Emily on the doorstep. Behind her, her car was packed with suitcases and boxes, as if she had hurriedly packed up her entire life and stuffed it into her vehicle. James looked at her, surprised, but before he could say anything, Emily looked him directly in the eye and asked if she could stay at our house. I walked over to the door, sensing that something serious was going on. "What happened, Emily?" I asked, trying to understand the situation. Emily sighed deeply and looked down before responding. "I had a fight with Mark," she began. "Things have been really tough between us, especially with all the money issues. I just couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to leave the house. I don't want to be there right now." That's when James made a decision. He told Emily, "You can't stay here." Then he turned around and headed back into the kitchen without saying another word. I swear, I have never seen him look so hurt in my life. Emily stood there, shocked by James' response. I stayed at the door with her, watching as her eyes filled with tears. I knew I had to say something, so with as much calm as I could muster, I explained, "Emily, I know this is hard, but James has made it clear that you can't stay here, and I respect his decision." Emily looked at me with a mix of desperation and surprise. "Mom, you don't have to listen to James. He's not even my biological father, but I'm your daughter. You should let me stay," she said, trying to appeal to our biological connection as if that should carry more weight in this moment. But the truth is, regardless of that, too much had changed. "Emily," I responded firmly, "regardless of whether it's James' decision, I also think it's not a good idea for you to stay here. There's too much pain and too many unresolved things. I don't think it's what's best for any of us right now." She tried to push further, begging me to let her stay, but I stood my ground. I knew I had to be firm for the sake of all of us. Without saying much more, Emily turned, got back into her car, and drove away. This has been one of the hardest moments we've had to face as a family, but I also know it was necessary. The wounds that have been left between us can't be healed overnight, and while it hurts to make these decisions, I know that sometimes it's the only way to protect yourself and others. I haven't heard from her since, so I assume she's found another place to stay or gone back to Mark. It's tough as a mother, but I believe it was something that had to be done. I've talked to James, and we both agree that just because she's in trouble doesn't mean we're going to forget everything. I wish we hadn't reached this point, but sometimes life is more complicated than we'd like it to be.